For years, people have flocked to the Sorceress in Diablo 2 for her ability to make light work of bosses and level 85 areas. And of course, because of teleport. In particular, the Cold Sorceress has been a crowd favorite due to her speed at which she can farm endgame areas and bosses. But which version of the Cold Sorceress is best for your playstyle? In this video, we're gonna look at two versions of the Cold Sorceress, Orb and Blizzard, all to determine which one we might be playing when Diablo 2 Resurrected comes out. Let me know your favorite version and why down in the comments, and let's dive in. No matter which version of the Cold Sorceress you run, you're going to have an advantage in farming certain areas. Common areas to farm with a Cold Sorceress are Ancient Tunnels, Pindle, Mephisto, the Secret Cow level, and eventually the Chaos Sanctuary. So the real question becomes more about your playstyle. Are you the type of person that could farm Pindle until you pass out over your keyboard? Well, good news for you. In D2R, you might be able to do just that. In beta testing, we experimented to see if the dreaded Realm Down was still a thing on new Battle.net. This is where you could get temp banned for creating games too quickly. Much to my surprise, we were not able to trigger this on new Battle.net. So if nothing changes in that regard, you should build a Blizz Sorceress and farm Pindle for days. But if that's not your thing and you want to do a comparable amount of damage and open up other options for farming in the areas that we talked about, maybe an Orb Sorc is the way to go. Now, before I explain each of these builds, I want to let you know what we did to reach our conclusions. For a couple of days on stream, we tested a variety of different versions of the Cold Sorceress. We started at level 75 and tried to keep our gear as early game as possible. We also focused on cold spells as our primary spells. So builds like MeteOrb or Fireball Orb were out of the question. Those are fire builds first and splash cold spells. We wanted to know which Cold Sorceress variant was the best for a diversified D2R experience that also allowed us to farm our target areas very quickly. We actually timed a few runs for Mephisto and Ancient Tunnels back to back, and we found that the clear speeds between the Orb Sorceress and Blizzard Sorceress were pretty similar. The Orb Sorceress seemed to have an advantage in open areas, while the Blizz Sorceress could easily lay waste to single target enemies or even just congested small groups of them. Let's take a look at each build and examine their strengths. Let's start with the Blizz Sorc here, and I'm gonna build it right in front of you so you can see everything that I'm doing with my stat points and my skill points. First, you'll notice that we're level 80 here. We were gonna start at 75, but after all of the testing and everything, we gained a couple of levels. So I'm gonna leave those stat points out for now. What we do is put just enough points into strength to wear all of our gear. After we get 156 strength for our Spirit Monarch, we can dump the rest of our points right into Vitality. Now, as for skills, I'm gonna walk you through some of the 1-point wonders first, and I'll also point out some things that you might think are 1-point wonders, but they're definitely not. There's a reason, and we'll get to those in a moment. First and foremost, the most important 1-point wonder is Teleport. We're gonna put 1 point into Telekinesis to get there, and 1 point into Teleport. We are not going to put a point into Static Field. More on this in a moment. The second 1-point wonder is obviously Warmth, gives a huge boost to mana recovery, super important on a Sorceress. With the Blizz Sorceress, you're obviously going to want to max Blizzard. It's gonna be our main attack here, so we are gonna put 20 points into that. The next skill that you should focus on with your points is Cold Mastery. You want to essentially get this so that it rips away 135% resists to all enemies. That's equivalent to putting about 17 hard points into it with this build. Reason being is a lot of the monsters that we see in the common areas that we farm, this level of Cold Mastery will reduce their resistances to -100, which is the max that you can go with any enemy in Diablo 2. Go ahead and max out Ice Blast next. This is a very important backup skill for the Blizzard Sorceress, and it will allow you to launch some attacks in between the blizzards that you cast. And if you can master that timing, you're gonna be pretty solid on a Blizzard Sorc. Then you can dump the rest of your points into Ice Bolt and max that out, and any points that you have left over, feel free to throw those into Glacial Spike. Now, I am going to stop at 5 skill points remaining here to remain true to that level 75 that we were supposed to build this at. And I've just noticed that I dumped all of my points into vitality. Trust me, I did you a favor by saving you all of those clicks. That being said, this is what your damage looks like when you have statted all of your points. It's definitely not what you're going to see from an end game Blizzard Sorc, but with early to mid game budget gear, this is what we're rocking. Let me talk about why we do not put 1 point into either static field or frozen armor. Let's start with static field. Static field is an amazing skill when you're progressing through the game, when you're leveling up, or when you're just doing your first playthrough for the season. But when you get to the point of farming bosses or farming end game areas, even with budget gear, static field loses a lot of its value. And the reason for that is that you're not going to run into a lot of cold resist monsters in the areas that we're farming. And if you're running into monsters that have too much life and that take too long to kill, don't farm those monsters or farm a different area. The purpose of farming is to be able to get through an area very quickly with as least resistance as possible. And the other typical 1 point wonder that we do not put a point into is frozen armor. Our strategy with a Cold Sorc is to not get hit. You don't want to find yourself in those situations where monsters are too close. Some people think that frozen armor preemptively reaches out and freezes the monsters as they're approaching you. It does not. It waits for them to hit you. So in those scenarios, even if you do like getting up close and personal with monsters, there are better options such as Ice Blast to preemptively strike them with, which will freeze them in place and prevent you from taking any damage in the first place. If you do want to follow this build and you're like, wow, I just can't do it without frozen armor, you could always just shop a staff that gives a bonus to frozen armor and then swap weapons and cast it from there. No harm done. It's definitely not a bad skill to have active, but when it comes to core points, I wouldn't suggest wasting one here, especially at level 75. Let me show you exactly what's on the Sorceress. This will be exactly the same for both the Orb Sorc and this version, the Blizzard Sorc. First and foremost, Spirit Sword, very, very important. You all know why. We use stealth armor to help us get to 105% cast. And in my opinion, that is the most important thing to get or to make sure that you have with all of the gear that you're wearing early on. Good old Ort Soul for lore here in the helm. Pretty simple, pretty cheap rune word. We have a +2 cold skills amulet, and we do have a Spirit Monarch. Some people would argue, oh, this is an early game. It's actually super simple to get. Just collect any white monarch that you find in hell difficulty, and Larzuk will give it 4 sockets when you get to Act 5. The belt is something that we ran into here on some of our MF runs. It's just IK's belt. If you don't have one of these, literally, it doesn't matter. Your resistances aren't really that important with this build. You can actually get away with having pretty terrible ones. So just about any belt you can find that will hold 4 rows of potions, good enough. The boots look pretty fancy, but the only thing that really matters here is, well, nothing. We have a 10% FCR ring, and we have Trangul's gloves to help us hit that 20 cast. Now, these might actually be the rarest item on the build, and I only use these for demonstration purposes. If you don't have these or can't find these early on, A, do some more Nightmare Mephisto runs, or B, just use a 10% FCR ring. You notice we're not even using another ring on this build, and additionally swap out your amulet for something with 10 cast. What I'm doing now is I'm actually gonna go do a Mephisto run just to show you how quickly and easily this girl can get the job done. Now, I'm not gonna do something that a lot of players do when they're going up against Mephisto, and that is, first of all, stat my damn skills correctly on my hotkeys. But second of all, I'm not going to moat trick Mephisto as much as you would think. It's something that I believe is overrated. Mephisto's AI isn't really that great. And, you know, he gives you a lot of opportunities to kill him. Like right there, he was just focusing on our merc so much that we didn't really need to moat trick him. And it's actually faster if you can predict his patterns, get in the habit of recognizing his AI, and just dance around him. And that is extremely easy to do when your Sorceress has 105% cast. Oh, I almost forgot to show you our Mercenary's gear. We have literally the junkiest stuff on this guy. We found a Twitch throw along the way. We got a nice helm that has resistances, but that is also min damage bugged. So he's got a nice helm with 19 to resistances and a little bit to max damage. And then obviously insight on the Mercenary is pretty good for a Sorceress, especially when you're going to be teleporting around. I did build this in a very weak base. However, When you finally do find a better base for your insight, it actually opens up a lot of options for you when it comes to farming. So for example, if you have a weak base for an insight, I wouldn't advise doing Chaos Sanctuary runs with your Blizzard Sorc. But the second that you find some sort of elite F polearm, or even just an elite polearm that does a decent amount of damage, it opens up a lot of doors for you in Chaos Sanctuary, because now the cold immune Oblivion Knights, your Mercenary can actually kill them after you've cleaned up all of the rest of the monsters. It also does help when you're doing Pindle runs and Pindle spawns as cold immune, because Pindle actually hits pretty hard. And hey, look at that. First try, Pindle cold immune. Let's clean up the rest of these guys. And then bam, like right away, Merc takes him right out. It's really good when you're running into single targets like that that are cold immune. Your Mercenary can pretty easily take care of them. And a Blizzard Sorceress is probably better than an Orb Sorceress when you're actually doing Pindle. Because Orb has that large area effect, it sort of falls a little short when you're in that tiny tunnel and you're trying to aim an attack at a group of monsters. For situations like that, and also such as in the cow level, Blizzard is, in my opinion, way better than Orb, because it can be cast directly down on top of large groups of clustered up enemies and do significant amounts of damage. Now let's take this opportunity to show you what an Orb Sorceress looks like as opposed to the Blizzard Sorc. Now, you do have some options depending on where you put your skills with an Orb Sorceress. The big advantage to using an Orb Sorceress is that you have a ton of skills left over after maxing Orb, its synergy, and getting Cold Mastery to an appropriate level. The reason this is good is because it allows you to diversify the build. And you could go a lot of different ways with that. You could stat skills like Fireball, or my favorite, Firewall. You could go into some lightning spells just to allow yourself to deal a diversified source of damage. The other option that you have is you could use Memory on your swap and turn this Orb Sorceress into an ES Orb Sorceress, which will significantly improve your survivability. If you go that route, you'll probably want to split your remaining points among Vitality and Energy, and usually pretty evenly. But for just about every other variation of this Sorceress, we're going to dump the rest of our points into Vitality. I did it again. We use the same 1-point wonders, telekinesis, teleport, 1 into warmth. First and foremost, we're gonna max Ice Bolt. Then we're gonna work our way all the way down to Orb, and we're gonna max that as well. The same logic applies for Cold Mastery. You're gonna wanna get this to practically the same level, 135 minus resistances to your enemies. Now, if you take out those 5 additional points that we have from leveling up and testing this build out, you'll notice that we would have 22 extra points to do something with. In our experimentation on stream, we did notice that the best route to go if you're going to diversify your damage, your best option that does the most amount of damage with only these 22 skills is Firewall. It's also extremely useful because you can drop Firewall right down on top of your enemy. And especially with the AI of some of the enemies that we're going up against, they just stand there in it. They don't even move. So it's almost the perfect skill to mix with your Orb Sorceress. While you're controlling the field with Orb, you can cook another monster with Firewall. You'll obviously want to put 1 point into Fire Mastery if you do that. And then you want to put most of your points into Firewall. And then any that you have left over, put them into Warmth or Fire Mastery, or what I would suggest is breaking them up evenly as you level up. It's gonna do about 3,000 damage per second, which is extremely efficient for the low amount of skills that we've put into this. But we do have one final trick up our sleeve with the Orb Sorceress, and I do believe this is the build that I will use for D2R. It actually might allow us to take advantage of the power of both skill sets in one build. Let me show you what I mean. I'm gonna retoken here again, and I'm gonna go through the exact same process with the stats. Just enough points into strength, the rest of them are gonna go into vitality. God damn it, I tried to do it right this time. I just clicked so much, and I overshot it by 2. Fuck. After we max Orb, Ice Bolt, and put the appropriate amount of points into Cold Mastery, we can then distribute the rest of our 22 points into both Blizzard and Ice Blast. Blizzard does about half the amount of damage, but for all intents and purposes, it's actually still good enough. If we go down here and do a Pindle run, you'll see that Blizzard still hits pretty hard. I need to put Ice Blast on my left click. It still hits hard enough to do a pretty significant amount of damage and clean up those enemies very, very quickly. The only real difference is that when you go and fight Mephisto, you are going to want to rely on Orb as your direct source of damage. Once you get used to the AI of Mephisto, he actually isn't really that bad. You can see us right here. Merc is protecting us. We're kind of safe. We're just sitting here tanking Mephisto's crap. And pretty easy. In conclusion, we can say that both versions of the Cold Sorc really do have their perks. It all depends on your playstyle and how you will have fun playing the game. Do you want to farm Pindle over and over and over and over again? Then probably go Blizz Sorc. If you're looking to MF in diversified areas where you can tackle enemies at great range and all over the screen, you should definitely think about using an Orb Sorceress. If you're like us and you want to do the best of both, I would highly suggest the build that you just saw. What I say is no matter what type of character you build in D2R, as long as you're having fun with it, you're doing the right thing. Thanks so much for watching this video. I'll catch you in the next one.